Hey folks, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and today I'm going to go way back in time and review another old school adventure, Unnight, which was the very first standalone science fiction adventure ever published for GURPS, first printed way back when in 1988. Unnight combines a deep description of a technologically backwards lost colony with an adventure that's designed to give players their very first experience with the mysterious planet. Lost in a nebula for over 500 years, Unnight offers space explorers rich rewards and untold secrets. What befell the original colonists? Why does the planet seem to cause hallucinations and madness? And what is the agenda of its wizards, a cast of people who still wield the powers of futuristic bioscience? Now, if you're not familiar with GURPS, no problem, keep watching. You see, GURPS, especially back in the 1980s, was a really interesting game design experiment because it promised that you could use the same exact system to run everything from a Dungeons & Dragons fantasy adventure all the way to a far future science fiction one. But in the first few years of GURPS, it had largely stuck to medieval fantasy. But by the mid to late 80s, it suddenly lurched into the future with several books that focused on science fiction, including some really cool licensed material along with some original worlds. I was so excited to watch this happen as a kid. I loved D&D and GURPS, and I had dabbled in Star Frontiers, so when GURPS Space and Unnight came out, I was ready to put on my space helmet, grab my laser pistol, and roleplay science fiction for really the very first time. And obviously, there was a ton of pressure on Unnight, because could it deliver a thrilling original science fiction adventure for GURPS? Could it describe a world that my players would want to explore for session after session? And does Unnight even still hold up today? Is it worth running after 30 years after it was printed? Well, you're going to find out all of that in my review today. So set the coordinates for the jump to hyperspace and get ready for some serious spoilers. Let's punch it. Unnight was written by Stephen Jones. The entire book is 64 pages, but the adventure is only 10 pages long. Even though it's only 10 pages long, it's a pretty open-ended adventure, so it'll probably take your group a few sessions to get through. Now, I'm not going to review the entire Unnight book since most of it's just background material on the world itself. I'm going to review its adventure, which in theory should act as a great standalone introduction to the Unnight world and start to introduce some of its mysteries. Before I get fully going, I want to point out that I think writing a great science fiction adventure is actually pretty hard. One of the main reasons is that there's not really a standard default world for sci-fi like there is with fantasy. You can basically take virtually any Dungeons & Dragons adventure and run it in any campaign world with just a little bit of modifications. But that's generally not true with science fiction. A Star Wars planet is going to feel very different from a location in the expanse. There's just so much variety in science fiction. Aliens, technology, space opera versus hard sci-fi, etc. And GURPS tried to build adventures that would generally fit into any GM's game. And so Unnight is sort of designed to do that. You could take this adventure and mostly fit it into any type of sci-fi game, at least one on a planetary scale. And that's a compliment to the adventure. The author, I think, clearly tried to make it interesting but generic enough that most GMs could use it. I could see Han Solo and Chewie landing on this world as much as I could see Captain Kirk and Spock beaming down there. Okay, so let's talk about the world itself for a few minutes, because obviously you have to understand the world to kind of get where the adventure's going. Unnight is a mysterious binary world circling a lonely red sun located deep in a nebula. The planet's been lost for generations. The planet was originally colonized by 500,000 indigenous peoples who left Earth in the late 21st century. The ships carrying the men and women had a navigational accident and emerged from hyperspace far from their original target, and they were forced to settle on Unnight. The planet's climate, lack of flora and the total lack of supplies made the colonists desperate. Worse, the planet was subject to a strange event called the Night Dance, a psychic event that could strike people seemingly randomly, causing seizures, bouts of insanity, hallucinations, and amnesia. The combination of all of these dangers overcame the colonists, and after hundreds of years, it caused them to split into factions and eventually regress back to the technological Dark Ages. By the time the PCs find the planet, several nations exist on Unnight, but they are primitive. Think something from our own medieval era, but influenced by an amalgam of native Earth cultures, some of which is handled okay, and others over the decades hasn't aged that well. There are, however, a few men and women called the Wizards who still have access to late 21st century technology, the best of which is their knowledge of bioengineering. There's some decent mysteries on the planet that the players can discover if they campaign there for a while, such as the planet was once terraformed by an ancient alien species. The center of its sister planet, in fact, is made out of space-age foam. And that mysterious night dance is actually due to a malfunctioning telepathic information system that the planet used to feature, along with hologram projectors. And people go crazy because the AI of the system is sort of randomly beaming information into people's heads. Imagine like if Reddit went sentient and beamed random forum posts from the internet into your head. You'd go crazy too. The adventure in Unnight is called First Contact, and as you can imagine, it's designed to introduce your players to this lost colony. And that puts a lot of pressure on this adventure, because if you're going to introduce your players to a brand new planet, it better be good in that first adventure. Otherwise, they'll just jet off and go to another planet and have another adventure in your universe. My expectations for a planetary adventure in any sci-fi game is that it makes the players hungry to explore the world more, it features something truly alien or unusual, and like any space adventure, it has some interesting danger in it, because space, after all, should be dangerous. Did somebody say space is dangerous? Not so dangerous to this guy. The adventure begins with the PCs as new passengers on board a trade ship, although this is generic enough that you could probably reskin this to whatever works for your campaign. The ship is captained by the very confident man named Calvin Mordreet. But midway to their next destination, Captain Mordreet and his crew suddenly pull the ship off course and start heading into the Meshwan Nebula without any explanation. After the PCs undoubtedly confront the captain, he admits that he's set a course for an undiscovered lost colony. He received the coordinates from an old shipmate and is heading there quickly because he wants to secure a trade contract. I do wish that the adventure had a more exciting opening. An NPC captain wanting to secure a trade contract isn't exactly exciting stuff. The adventure also can't seem to make up its mind about the captain. It suggests that the GM could either make him a helpful, adventurous merchant explorer or someone untrustworthy whose recklessness and greed will eventually turn him into a foe. Options are good in adventures, but those are very different personalities for the captain, and as a result, the adventure doesn't really take a side. It leaves the captain's characterization and the resulting actions that he might take just entirely up to the GM. And they do this with the crew too, mentioning that each one of the 5 crew members has their own motivations and secrets, but none of that actually impacts the events to come. But at least the adventure injects some urgency here. Captain Mordreet knows that there's other privateers on the way to Unnight. The shipmate that gave him the coordinates has loose lips. And there are clear rules established to how one signs a new trade contract with a brand new world. It has to be signed by a strong national government leader, since Unnight doesn't have a unified world government at this point. Navigating to Unnight turns out to be pretty straightforward. I wish that the adventure had a section where the players and the captain had to navigate through a dangerous nebula in order to find the lost colony, but none of that's there. The players just sort of arrive. And when they do, their scanners don't pick up any signs of civilized life. After all, Unnight is still in its dark ages. However, the remains of the planet's original 500-year-old colony ship, the Ark, are still there, orbiting the planet. And the PCs can go explore the ship. But other than the evidence of some old cryopods, some remains of dead colonists, and lots of information on the planet of Unnight itself, there's just nothing really that interesting on the ship. And I think that this is another huge missed opportunity because exploring a derelict starship is a classic science fiction setup.
This is Commander Connors. Looks like everything's all safe over here. Nothing on board this old derelict. Why don't you tell the whole crew to come on over?
It's just frustrating that there's no danger here, no real mysteries. It's just a broken down ship. I actually suggest that if you run this adventure, rather than giving the PCs a ton of hard drives with the information on Unnight on them, have a few still frozen colonists on the ship. Perhaps their cryopods malfunctioned, and the 21st century crew hundreds of years ago were too afraid to unfreeze them in their current state. But the PCs with their far future technology can easily do so. And this actually gives the players who are playing engineering or medical type characters something interesting to do. And then these unfrozen NPCs can then serve to give the players a better guide to the world that they're about to explore versus just reading about it in a bunch of handouts that you have to make or just handing them the Book of Unnight and telling them to read up. As soon as the players are done exploring the derelict, their ship's alarms suddenly go off because they're detecting electricity from the planet below. The players won't know this yet, but the wizards are experimenting with Tesla coils to create a sort of fireworks display to celebrate the ascension of a new leader in one of the nations on the planet, a man named Jamjil Su. The event will likely cause your players to want to travel down to that specific location to see what's going on. And I think this is actually a clever way to get the PCs to arrive in a specific area of the planet, since a lot of sci-fi struggles with this. Like, when a planet has nations and is huge, how do you get the PCs to arrive in that one location that you've sketched out for your adventure? Surprise Tesla fireworks in a medieval society is actually a great way to catch your players' attention and cause their curiosity to peak. Investigating the surges of electricity, the PCs will arrive in a large and wealthy city, Bayerville, which is run by a corrupt city council and its brand new warlord, Jamjil Su, who is having a little coronation ceremony. This provides the PCs with an immediate angle on how to secure that trade deal. There are a few ways for the PCs to successfully win a contract. The first is to convince Jamjil Su to sign the contract. He's the leader of the nation, effectively. But he's described as being skeptical of any newcomers. After all, he just ascended to that position, and he's nervous that he has hidden enemies out there that are trying to influence him. Fair enough. Or the players can try to convince the council to vote on the trade agreement, which requires that they win over 3 out of the 5 council members. The third real way to get a contract is to find the wizards living in the city, win them over, and get them to use their influence to force the trade agreement to be agreed upon by the nation. Now, I'm just going to stop here and say right now that the adventure just entirely falls apart in this last section. It's like the author just ran out of page count and just barely sketched out the rest of the adventure from here. And it's too bad because I do think that there's potential here. I like that securing a trade deal has many routes of success and that the PCs will soon be deeply immersed in the politics of this lost colony. And the capital city being corrupt means that there's opportunity for backstabbing, bribery, and ulterior motives from a lot of interesting NPCs. But none of that is actually described here. The moment the PCs land on Unnight, the author just kind of lets the GM to figure out the rest of the adventure from there. For example, how do the Unnighters even react from PCs from off-world, centuries ahead of them in technology, arriving on their planet? What happens if some of the PCs are aliens? Like, how do they react to that? How does that go down? None of this is described at all. And who is this new warlord, Jamjil Su? Did he kill his predecessor? What are his plans for the nation? What's his relationship with the corrupt city council? And what about those city council members that the PCs have to convince to sign the treaty? They don't even get names in the adventure, much less motives or agendas. It would be awesome if, for example, each council member had his own motivation for signing or not signing a trade treaty. When I ran this adventure, I made one of the council members really want to assassinate the warlord. He was jealous of him and wanted to take his place. And that gave the PCs a chance to stop him and then win the trust of Jamjil-Su. Or they could help the assassination to install a more cooperative ruler in his place. I also made another council member a secret off-worlder. He crash-landed on the planet a few years ago, worked his way up in the hierarchy, but really all he wants to do is to get off the planet. And so he's a natural ally to the players. So you can make this interesting from this point on in the adventure, but it's literally all on you as a GM. Oh, and the adventure really just forgets about the wizards too. Like, what was going on with those Tesla coils? It's never mentioned. And is this cabal of secret technologists that Unnight spends so much time talking about, how will they view the PCs? Are the PCs threats to their status as enigmatic Illuminati rulers of Unnight? You find out none of this. There's no agendas, no statistics for the wizards, nothing. I was so frustrated that this adventure spends 4 pages describing that derelict spaceship and then less than 2 pages describing the entire back half of the adventure, which takes place in this sprawling city and is critical to the narrative. You do, however, get a random events table. And some of the random events could be cool. For example, there's an earthquake that could happen and the population blames the newly arrived PCs. Or there's a little blurb on a rogue wizard who decides to assassinate the PCs because he sees them as a threat. But again, there's just barely anything here. And worse, the adventure ends by saying that the adventure's not really over once the trade treaty is signed, because the PCs have to take the signed treaty back to a courtroom on a civilized planet somewhere else in the galaxy, which basically implies that the PCs are done with Unnight forever. And then it promises a follow-up adventure called Return to Unnight, which, to my knowledge, was never written or published. But in theory, if your players successfully mingle with the leaders of Byerville and don't get themselves killed, they can sign a trade deal and get a little wealthier. And maybe they'll think that the planet is cool enough to continue to explore it and find out all those mysteries, like how it was actually terraformed by ancient aliens and how its sister planet is made out of foam. But I really doubt that this will happen. This adventure is not a good one, and you really shouldn't run it today, unless you just absolutely love the setting that I just described. At the beginning of this video, I said that in a great planetary sci-fi adventure, I expect 3 things. 1, it makes the players hungry to explore the world. 2, it features something truly surprising or alien or unusual. And 3, it's dangerous in some way. You could argue that Unnight does the first one decently. A lost binary world, hidden in a nebula, with traces of high technology, in an otherwise medieval world. Well, that's kind of interesting. I could see that working in a Star Trek episode. But the adventure doesn't really double down on any of this. There's nothing surprising or alien or unusual here. The derelict that the PCs first explore is dull. There's nothing about the adventure's city locale that causes wonder for the players. And the NPCs are all barely described. In fact, you could take this entire setup and make it an Old West adventure.
All right, boys, you see that there hill right over there? Well, behind that hill is a lost town of Spanish conquistadors. It's a town called Unnight, and nobody's seen or heard from those conquistadors in over 100 years. But we're gonna be the first ones to talk to the mayor and convince him to let us build a railroad right through town. Let's ride!
And maybe Unnight is limited because the civilization is set in the Dark Ages, so there's not likely to be any sci-fi weirdness. But come on, where in the adventure is that cool hint of ancient aliens, or that the wizards of bioengineering might be capable of something never before seen? There's just none of this in this introduction to Unnight, and that's just disappointing. And finally, as far as danger in this adventure, well, there just really isn't any. Players who like role-playing and trade negotiations might like this adventure if the GM adds pages and pages of original material. But players who like a little blaster rifle action are going to be bored. Even though the background section of Unnight describes things like weird armadillo centipede monsters and living trees that can beat the crap out of PCs, they don't feature at all in this adventure. There's no mention of how to use the night dance, that weird hallucinatory effect that the planet causes that could instill fear and terror in your PCs. There's no clear antagonist unless you choose to either create your own or use Captain Mordreet, or create your own wizard, or maybe one of the council members decides to act that way. So ultimately, Unnight is an underbaked disappointment. It's really not worth going back and playing today. And by the way, back in 1988, when I first did play this adventure, I think Unnight actually killed my GURPS space campaign dead. We played about 3/4 the way through this adventure and nobody really wanted to play anymore. At the time, I thought maybe I ran the adventure wrong because my players loved all the other GURPS adventures like Harkwood and Orc Slayer and those cool post-apocalyptic adventures from the AADA road atlases. So surely Unnight had to be good too, right? No, it wasn't good and it still isn't good today. And worst of all, it came out in 1988, which is the same year that one of the best sci-fi adventures came out, Star Wars' Tatooine Manhunt, which features the characters having to chase down a mysterious general and convince him to join the Rebel Alliance. It has these amazing action set pieces, great NPCs, and actual RPG innovations like how to do cutaway scenes in adventures to capture a cinematic feel. Unnight was received so poorly by my group that my players fully switched over to Star Wars D6 for many months because of it. And that's a real shame because, like I said at the top, so much pressure was on GURPS at this point to show that it could pull off really great science fiction. And I think that this adventure is probably one of the reasons that started the misinformation that you just can't write adventures for GURPS and that it's too sprawling of a system that relies too much on GM creativity, so it's impossible to write a good prepackaged adventure for GURPS. I think that is so wrong because I look at adventures like The Pirates of Drinax or Dolmenwood or Two-Headed Serpent, and they all would have been amazing if they had been written for GURPS. But I've done what I can, and if you're looking for a good GURPS adventure, go check out oneshotadventures.com, where you'll find over 30 free adventures in a variety of genres. And if you enjoyed this old school review and want to see more videos like it, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Oh, and if you've adventured in Unnight, I'd love to know how it went. Let me know in the comments below. Maybe I did get it wrong, and this led to a delightful sci-fi campaign for some of you. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, if your GM presents you with a derelict spaceship, always wear a sturdy helmet and set your blaster rifle to kill. It's the only plan that works.